Today I'm going to be talking about verse 18 of Upadēśa Undiyār. To give the connection with the previous verse, what Bhagavan said in the previous verse is Manatin uruve maravāducchāva maṇameṇa mondrile undīpaṛa mākam ner ākam id undīpaṛa. That means when one investigates the form of the mind without forgetting or without neglecting or abandoning or giving up, there is not anything called mind. This is the direct path for everyone whomsoever. So in this verse, Bhagavan says that if we investigate the mind, the implication, if we investigate it keenly enough, we will find, he doesn't say we will find, but that again is the implication, but there's not anything called mind. There's no such thing as mind at all. However, though no mind actually exists, so long as we don't investigate ourselves clearly enough, we seem to be this mind. So in the next verse, verse 18, the verse we're going to be talking about today, Bhagavan talks more about what is the mind. But again, just to clarify about what he says in verse 17, he says if one investigates the form of mind without forgetting, there's not anything called mind. So if there's nothing called mind, why in the next verse does he go on to say more about what the mind is? As I say, so long as we do not investigate ourselves keenly enough, we seem to be this mind. To explain this with an analogy, if we mistake a snake to be if we mistake a rope to be a snake, if we look at it carefully enough, we will see that it's not a snake. There's no snake there at all. It's only a rope. However, so long as we don't look at it carefully enough, so long as we're afraid of it and too afraid to go close, we won't look at it carefully enough, and therefore we will continue mistaking the rope to be a snake. So though there is no snake there at all, the snake seems to be there, and consequently it's creating fear in us. Likewise, though ultimately there's no such thing as mind at all, until we investigate ourselves keenly enough, mind seems to exist. If we investigate this mind keenly enough, then we will see what we actually are is not this mind, but just pure awareness. When we see ourselves as pure awareness, that is like seeing that the snake is just a rope. We can no longer mistake ourselves to be mind. So mind doesn't exist at all. Just like once you see the rope as a rope, you can no longer mistake it to be a snake. So though there never was any snake there, so long as we didn't investigate it keenly enough, it seemed to be there. Likewise, though there's actually no such thing as mind, so long as we don't investigate it keenly enough, it seems to be there. Many people of the neo-Advaita persuasion, that is, many of the would-be gurus of the present day, take this teaching of Bhagavan very lightly. They say, oh, Bhagavan has said there's no ego, there's no mind, so there's nothing for us to worry about. Well, that would be great if there was nothing to worry about, but so long as we experience ourselves as the mind, we all know this mind creates troubles for us. In fact, the mind is the root of all troubles, according to Bhagavan. So it is a problem, so long as we mistake ourselves to be mind. So in the next verse, Bhagavan goes on to clarify what the mind is. So this is verse 18, which is the verse we're going to talk about today. What he says in the first sentence, I'll read the whole verse first and then go through it more closely. He says, ḻēmaṉam, yāviṇ-um nāṉeṇum, eṇṇam-ē mūlamā mundīpaṛa, yāṇā maṉam, eṇal lundīpaṛa. This is 3 sentences. The first sentence is eṇṇaṅgaḷ-ē maṉam. eṇṇaṅgaḻ-ē maṉam means thoughts alone are mind. We can also take it the other way around to say mind alone is thoughts. It means the same either way. But the order in which it comes in reverse is eṇṇaṅgaḻ-ē. Thoughts alone are mind. eṇaṅgaḻ, eṇnum means thought. eṇaṅgaḻ is the plural, thoughts. And eṇaṅgaḻ-ē, the A is a intensifier, so that conveys the, that implies alone. So that's why eṇaṅgaḻ-ē I translate as thoughts alone, maṇam, our mind. It's important here to clarify what Bhagavan means by thought. Generally, when we talk about thoughts, people often consider the chatter going on in their mind, the constant chatter that's going on in our mind. They are thoughts. So when, for example, Bhagavan says, whenever any thought arises, we should investigate to whom does it arise, and then thereby turn our attention back towards ourselves. People wait for the next verbalized thought, the next piece of mental chatter to pop up in order to pose this question. That is not what, I mean, the mental chatter are also thoughts, but what Bhagavan uses the term thoughts in a much broader sense. According to Bhagavan, all mental phenomena of any kind whatsoever are thoughts. And since according to Bhagavan, all thoughts are mental, all phenomena are thoughts, according to Bhagavan. So whether it's memories or perceptions or emotions or whatever it may be, everything that appears and disappears is a thought. All phenomena are thoughts. So Bhagavan uses thought in a very broad sense. Just to give some backing from Bhagavan's teachings, in nāṇeṇu, in the fourth paragraph, he says in one sentence, okay, the whole, actually this sentence is this paragraph is very relevant here. So I'll read from the beginning, because Bhagavan is also saying here what the mind is. He says in the first sentence, maṇam embadu atma-sarupa tilulla or adiseya shakti. That means what is called mind is an extraordinary power, Adiseya Shakti means extraordinary power, but exists in Atma-swarupa. Atma-swarupa means the real nature of ourself. So Atma-swarupa means what we actually are. So mind, what is called mind, is just an extraordinary power that exists within ourselves as we actually are. Adu sakala nene-vugalayum totru kindradu. That means the mind, that extraordinary power, causes all thoughts to appear. Sometimes that totru kindradu, it literally means causes to appear. It's sometimes translated as projects. But that's also a suitable way of translating it, but I prefer to translate it as more literally as it causes all thoughts to appear. So the cause of all thoughts is mind. And then he says in the next sentence, Ninevugale elam niki parkindra podu, when removing all thoughts or setting aside all thoughts, we see taniyai manam endro porol illai. Separately, there is no such thing as mind. Ahayal nineve manatin sarupam. Therefore, thoughts alone are the nature of the mind. So what he says in this sentence, ahayal nineve manatin sarupam, is what he says in verse 18. But mind is nothing but thought. The thoughts alone are mind. So the mind consists of nothing but thoughts. Then he goes on to say, in this fourth paragraph of nāṇa, Nenevugule tavitu jagam endro porol anyamai ille. That means, excluding thoughts, there is no separate thing called world. The implication is that the world is nothing but thoughts. And in the 14th paragraph, he says very explicitly towards the end, Jagam embadu Nineveh. That means what is called the world is only thoughts. So according to Bhagavan, why is it only thoughts? Because as he says in Uludunapadu, in the 6th verse of Uludunapadu, he says, Ulahu aim pulangal uru. The world is a form of 5 sense impressions. Thereunto, not anything else. So what we call the world, if we think about it, the world consists of what? In our experience, the world consists of sights, sounds, tastes, smells, and tactile sensations. Remove these 3, and where is any world? So the world is nothing but these 5 sense impressions, because according to Bhagavan, the world doesn't exist independent of our perception of it. Just like in dream, the world we see in a dream is just our own mental projection. According to Bhagavan, the world we see now is equally our own mental projection. It is just a picture created out of these 5 types of sense impressions. And then he goes on to say, those 5 sense impressions are impressions to the 5 sense organs. Since the mind alone, or since the one mind, it can be taken either way, perceives the world by way of the 5 sense organs, say, is there a world besides the mind? So according to Bhagavan, the world has no existence independent of the mind that perceives it. Coming back to this 4th paragraph, he goes on to 4th paragraph of nāṇa, he goes on to say this. As I said, he said in the last sentence I read was Ninevugale tavitu jagam endro porol anyamai ille. Excluding thoughts, there is not separately any thing called mind, anything called world, sorry. Tukatil Ninevugal ille, jagamum ille. In sleep, there are no thoughts, there is also no world. Jagra swapnangalil, in waking and dream, Ninevugal ulla, there are thoughts, jagamum undu, there is also the world. What are we to imply from this? To infer from this? In sleep, when there are no thoughts, there is also no world. In waking and dream, when there are thoughts, there is also world. The implication is that the world is nothing but thoughts. And then he gives an analogy. Silindi puchi epidi tan idam irandu, veliyil nule nutru marupadium tan ul irtu kolkiragalo. That is just like the spider spins, spins out thread from within itself, and again draws it back into itself, Upadēśa. In the same way, the mind, maṇamum tan iditilirandu, jagate totru vittu, marupadium tadidame oduki kolkiradu. In exactly the same way, the mind also causes this world to appear, or projects this world from within itself, and again draws it back into itself. That is, as soon as the mind rises in waking or dream, it projects the world. When it subsides, it draws that world back into itself. That is, the world disappears along with the mind, in other words. And therefore, he says, Manam Atma Sarupatinindru Velipadam Podu Jagam Tondram. When the mind comes out from Atma Sarupa, from our real nature, the world appears. Obviously, when he said the mind comes out from, when the mind comes out from Atma Sarupa, there is nothing outside Atma Sarupa, because Atma Sarupa is the pure awareness in which everything appears. So but metaphorically, he says, that is when we rise as mind, we are thereby forsaking our real nature, which is pure awareness. Though we are always existing as pure awareness, we, so to speak, turn our mind, our back on the pure awareness that we actually are, and turn outwards, and thereby project the world. So when the mind comes out from Atma Sarupa, the world appears. Then he draws an important conclusion. Therefore, ahayal jagam tondram podu sarupam tondradu. Therefore, when the world appears, our real nature does not appear. So that means we are not aware of us. So long as we perceive any world, so long as we're aware of any world, we are not aware of ourselves as we actually are. That's the implication. But what he actually says is, when the world appears, Sarupam doesn't appear. Our real nature doesn't appear. Sarupam tondram, and then he puts in brackets prakasakam podu, jagam tondradu. When Sarupa appears, that is shines, it means when we become aware of ourselves as we actually are, is the implication. Jagam tondradu, the world does not appear. That is, it's only when we turn our attention away from ourselves that we see a world. When we turn our attention back towards ourselves, this world disappears, because the world has no existence independent of the mind. The paragraph goes on for a few more sentences, but that's the part which is most relevant to this verse that we're now dealing with. So Bhagavan says, when Bhagavan says eṇṇaṅgaḻ-ē, what he means by eṇṇaṅgaḻ, when he says eṇṇaṅgaḻ-ē, that means thoughts alone are mind, the first sentence of verse 18. What he means by thoughts is not just the mental chatter. He means, as I say, according to Bhagavan, Bhagavan uses thought in the sense of mental phenomena. So it includes mental phenomena of all kinds whatsoever, including perceptions, memories, emotions, feelings, desires, everything, all are thoughts, everything other than ourselves, everything other than the pure awareness that we actually are is a thought. All phenomena are thoughts, because all phenomena, according to Bhagavan, are mental. And what Bhagavan means by thoughts is mental phenomena of any kind whatsoever. So he first gives a general definition of the mind. Thoughts alone are the mind. But if we think about it, though thoughts alone are the mind, the thoughts are constantly changing. So is there nothing in the mind that is constant? Yes, there is one thing that is constant in the mind. That is what he, in the next sentence, he refers to as the root of the mind, the mūlam. What he says in the next sentence, after saying thoughts alone are mind, in the next sentence he says, yāviṇ-um, that means of all, implying of all thoughts, yāviṇ-um, nāṉeṇu eṇṇamē mūlamā. Of all, the thought called I alone is the root. The term mūlam, it's a Tamil form of the Sanskrit word mūla, which means root, base, foundation, origin, source, or cause. But simple meaning we can give here is root. But it has a range of meanings, but all closely related to root. So of all the thoughts, that of all implies of all the thoughts, the root is this thought called I. So what does Bhagavan mean by this thought called I? Bhagavan often refers to ego as the thought called I. Why does he do so? Because Bhagavan uses very, very simple language, but at the same time, his words are full of deep meaning. So in the English word ego comes from the Latin. In Latin, ego means I. So ego means nothing but I. Like the term that Bhagavan generally uses to refer to ego, sometimes he uses the term ahankara, which means it can be explained in ahankara, it's composed of two parts, aham, which means I, and kara, which means what is made. So the made I. But the term that Bhagavan generally used is ahande. Ahande is a Tamil form of the Sanskrit word ahanta. Ahanta means I-ness. So in whatever language, whether in Sanskrit or in Tamil or in English, the word, the ego means only I. But ego is not what we actually are. What we actually are is not a thought. But as Bhagavan says, ego itself is a thought. Of all thoughts, it's the first thought, the root of all other thoughts, but ego is a thought. Why does he say it's a thought? Because according to him, what actually exists is only our own real nature, which is pure awareness. Everything other than that is merely a mental creation. So it is all, not only all phenomena, but even the subject who is aware, not only everything that is perceived, that means all phenomena, but also the perceiver of all those phenomena. In other words, not only all the objects, but also the subject is a thought. Because the I that is aware of thoughts, namely ego, isn't permanent. In waking and dream, we are aware of ourselves as this ego. In sleep, this ego disappears altogether. So ego doesn't exist in sleep. So since it's something that appears and disappears, it is a thought. So Bhagavan often referred to ego as the thought called I. In English, it's often translated as I thought, but actually in the nān means I, eṇnum means which is called, eṇnum means thought. So the thought which is called I, or the thought called I, to put it simply. So of all thoughts, the thought called I is the root. Why is this thought called I the root of all other thoughts? Because no other thought is aware of either itself or anything else. Whereas this first thought I, though it's a thought, it's quite unlike all other thoughts because it is a thought that is aware both of itself and of all other thoughts. So all other thoughts exist only in the view of ego. In the absence of ego, there is no thought. As Bhagavan says in verse 26 of Uludunapadu, ahande undayin anetum undahum. If ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. What he refers to there as everything is what he refers to in this verse as thoughts, because thought, as I said, all phenomena are just thoughts. So if ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. Ahande indru anatum. If ego doesn't exist, everything doesn't exist. Ahande yāviṇ-um. Ego itself is everything, or ego alone is everything. Ahayal yādu idu indru nāṇaṅgaḻ-ē ovadul yāvam enor. Therefore, know that investigating what this is, that means what this ego is giving up everything. Why is investigating ego giving up everything? Because the nature of ego is such, so long as we are looking away from ourselves at other things, we seem to be ego. But when we turn our attention back towards ourselves, this ego, because it has ego cannot stand without grasping form, as he says in verse 25. So ego cannot stand without grasping form. So long as its attention is going outwards, it's grasping form in its attention. When it turns its attention back to itself, because ego is a formless phantom, as he again says in verse 25, it cannot stand without attending to things other than itself. When it turns its attention back on itself, it subsides and disappears. What he says in verse 25 is, Teidinal otum pidicum. If sought, it takes flight. So the nature of ego is such, it cannot stand without grasping thoughts. But when it turns its attention back on itself, it subsides and disappears. So when we investigate what this ego is, we are giving up everything. This is why everyone says, oh, this self-investigation is very difficult. It is not difficult. There cannot be anything easier than attending to ourselves. If we're able to attend to anything other than ourselves, it must be easier to attend to ourselves, because other things come and go. Ourself is the one thing that is permanent. So attending to ourselves is, according to Bhagavan, it's the easiest of all things. Why does it seem difficult? It is because of our reluctance to let go of other things. So long as we have the least desire or attachment for anything other than ourselves, we'll be unwilling to let go of that and turn our attention back towards ourselves. Because when we turn our attention back towards ourselves, this ego disappears and everything else disappears along with it. So until we are willing to give up everything, we will not be able to investigate ourselves keenly enough to see what we actually are. So the only obstacle to us in self-investigation is our unwillingness to turn our attention back towards ourselves. Sorry, I'm digressing, but because this is all related to the nature of the mind and the nature of the ego. So, as I say, in this verse, Bhagavan says, of all thoughts, this thought called I is the root, because the thought called I is the thinker of all other thoughts. That is, it is only in the view of the thought called I, but all other thoughts seem to exist. Only when we rise as ego, but all these phenomena, this whole world appears. And as Bhagavan says, this is all nothing but thoughts, just like the world we see in any other dream is just thoughts. This world is also just thoughts. Therefore, in the last sentence, he concludes, yāviṇ-um, maṉam, eṇal. That is the order of words he puts in the verse. But in the natural prose order, it would be maṉameṇa, yāviṇ-um. Here, eṇal means saying, but here he's using eṇal in the sense of embadu. Embadu means what is called. So maṇam eṇal means what is called mind, yāviṇ-um is I. Here, in this context, I refers to the thought called I, the first thought, the ego. So what the mind essentially is only this ego. All other thoughts come and go, so no other thought can be what the mind essentially is. Though the term mind, in many contexts when the term mind is used as a collective name for all thoughts. But when we analyze this mind, other thoughts come and go. The one thought that is constant is this thought called I. So what the mind essentially is this thought called I, in other words, ego. So this is a very important verse, because Bhagavan often uses the term mind. That is, we have to understand from this we can understand the term mind can refer to either of two things. Either it can refer to all thoughts collectively, or it can refer specifically to the first thought called I. All other thoughts are objects, whereas the first thought I is the subject. All other thoughts are things perceived, whereas the first thought I is the perceiver of all those things. So we need to understand from the context. On each occasion where the term mind is used by Bhagavan, we need to understand from the context whether he's using this term mind to refer to thoughts collectively or specifically to ego. In the majority of cases, he's using it to refer specifically to ego. For example, in the first sentence first two sentences of paragraph 4 of Upadēśa, which I read earlier, maṇameṇ Atma-vichara or Adisaya Shakti, what is called mind is an extraordinary power that exists in Atma-sarupa, adu sakala ninevu galayum totravikindrinu. It causes all thoughts to appear. So in this context, he's not using mind in the sense of the bundle of thought. He's using mind specifically to mean ego, because it is ego that causes all other thoughts to appear. It's only when we rise as ego that we bring all other thoughts into existence. So it is as ego that we are the cause of all other thoughts. So in this context, he's using the mind, he's using the term mind specifically to mean ego. But then he goes on to say, if we remove all thoughts and see, there's no, or if we see removing all thoughts, separately, there's no such thing as mind. Here, we could take mind either to refer to ego or to thoughts collectively. It's in some places it applies to both, because if we remove all other thoughts, we'll see there's no ego standing separately. That is because ego cannot exist without now, it is ego that causes all other thoughts to exist, to appear, but without clinging to the appearance of other thoughts, ego cannot stand. So it is both the cause of all other thoughts, and it is dependent on the other thoughts. That is, ego cannot exist without projecting thoughts and clinging to them. As he says in verse 25 of Upadēśa Undiyār, grasping form, it comes into existence. Grasping form, grasping form, it stands. Grasping and feeding upon forms, it flourishes greatly. So what he refers to in verse 25 as form is what he refers to in other contexts as thought, because all forms are only thoughts, and all thoughts are forms of one kind or another. So here, as I say, in this third sentence, we can take the sense in which he uses mind. It covers both thoughts collectively and ego. And then in the fourth sentence, he says, ahayal neneve manavtins rupam. Thought alone is the nature of the mind. Again, this could be taken as all the thoughts collectively make up the mind, or the root thought, I, is the nature of the mind. So we can, in some places, it doesn't matter whether, in what sense we interpret the term mind, whether specifically as ego or generally as the collection of thoughts, but in some cases, we have to understand he's referring specifically to ego. So whenever he refers to the mind as the perceiver, or the mind which is as that which is aware of anything, in that context, he's referring to what he means by the term mind is only ego, because ego is the only element of the mind that is aware of other things, that perceives anything. So ego is the perceiving element of the mind. All other thoughts are perceived elements of the mind. They're things that we perceive, not things that perceive anything. So that is the difference between this thought called I and all other thoughts. So what the mind essentially is only this first thought I. He doesn't say essentially, but the implication is there. I started by connecting this verse to the previous verse, verse 17, in which Bhagavan said there's no such thing as mind at all. But though there's no such thing as mind at all, so long as we do not attend to ourselves keenly enough, mind seems to exist. So what is mind? Mind is nothing but a collection of thoughts. In fact, in other words, thoughts alone have a mind. But of all these thoughts, the root of all the thoughts is this first thought called I. Therefore, mind is in essence nothing but this first thought. That's the implication of verse 18. To again put this verse in context, I can relate it to the previous verse in another way. Bhagavan begins verse 17 by saying, Manatin uruve maravado chava. That means when one investigates without forgetting, the form of the mind, when one investigates the form of the mind without forgetting. So he begins with this term, manatin uruve. Uruve is an accusative case form. The nominative case form is uru. So what does he refer to here as manatin uru, the form of the mind? In the previous verse, he referred to the mind's form of light. That is in verse 16, what he said is, ḻēmaṉam vittu, leaving external phenomena, maṉam tan oli uru ordale mundīpaṟa, mundīpaṟa. That means the mind knowing its own form of light is true awareness, is real awareness. So in this verse, he refers to the mind knowing its own form of light. So when we read verse 17, which he begins by saying manatin uruve, we can take that for the form of the form of the mind referred to in verse 17 as the mind's form of light. However, there's though that is true in a sense, it is not exactly what he means, because in verse 17, let's say, I won't say it's not exactly what he means, it is ultimately what he means, but there's an intermediate step, so to speak, which we're glossing over if we equate the manatin uru with the maṉam tan oli, it's the oli uru, the form of light. The form of light here in verse 16 refers to light here means awareness. And it's referring to the mind's own form of light is the mind's essential nature as pure awareness. So the mind's form of light is pure awareness. That is not what he's, well, I can't say it's not what he's referring to. It's not exactly, it's, as I say, there's a step missing, because though the mind is ultimately nothing but pure awareness, what we are now aware of as mind is though it is actually pure awareness, it seems to be something other than pure awareness. So though we can take the term manatin uruve in verse 17 to be referring to this form of light, it is more appropriate to take it, or that is, we can explain it more deeply by taking that manatin uruve to be what Bhagavan clarifies in verse 18. What is the essential form of the mind? Now, though the term mind is often used as a collective term to refer to all thoughts collectively, what the mind essentially is ego. So when he says in verse 17, manatin uruve Padacchēdam, he's referring to investigating ego. When we investigate ego keenly enough, without forgetting, without neglecting, without losing our hold on that self-attentiveness, we investigate the mind so keenly, we will find there's no such thing as mind at all. So when he says maṉameṉa, he's obviously not referring to the mind's form of light, but he refers to in the previous verse. That is, when he says there's no such thing as mind at all, he doesn't mean there's no such thing as that form of light, because that form of light is what alone is real. So how we have to understand this is, the term mind is often used as a collective term to refer to all thoughts. However, what the mind essentially is ego. What is ego? Bhagavan has clarified this in verse 24 of Ulladu. What he says in verse 24 is, in verse 24, he says, Jada udul nāṉeṇu. That literally means the insentient body does not say I. Though he uses the word eṇadu, which means does not say, he's using it here metaphorically. What he means by this is the Jada Udal, the insentient body, is not aware of itself as I. That is, what is a... Okay, I'll explain it down. So this body is Jada. That means, Jada means what is completely devoid of awareness. This body has no awareness of its own. So this body is not this body which is aware of itself as I. So he said the body, this Jada Udal does not say I. This insentient body does not say I. Then in the next sentence he says Sat-chit Undiyār. Sat-chit means, Sat means what is, what exists, existence. Chit means awareness. So Sat-chit means existence, awareness. It can also mean awareness of existence. We can take it either way. But Sat-chit does not rise. Sat-chit is what is real. That is the base awareness, the existing, not ego is a rising awareness. Our real nature is a being awareness. The nature of true awareness is not rising to know anything, but just being. So what he refers to as Sat-chit is that fundamental awareness, the awareness I am. When we say I am, we're not only express, I am literally means I exist. But though the explicit meaning of I am is I exist, the implied meaning of I am is I exist and I'm aware of my existence, because the first person pronoun I is the self-referential pronoun. Only that which is aware of itself can refer to itself. So in the term I am, though it is a statement of that we exist, it implies that we are aware, not only that we exist, but we are also aware of our existence. So Sat-chit is that fundamental awareness, the awareness of our own existence, I am. So Sat-chit Undiyār, Sat-chit does not rise. So this insentient body doesn't say I, Sat-chit doesn't rise. However, in the next sentence, he goes on to say, Udal alava nāṉeṇu udikum ideal. Udal alava means as the extent of a body. Nāṉeṇu means one thing I. We can take it as one thing called I. Udikum, rises. Ideal. Ideal means in between. That implies in between the insentient body and Sat-chit. Obviously, he's using the term ideal in between here in a metaphorical sense, because Sat-chit is the infinite whole. So the body doesn't exist outside Sat-chit. The body cannot exist independent of Sat-chit. So when he says in between, he's using that metaphorically. I often explain this by saying how we may sometimes use the term in between metaphorically. Supposing you read a story in the newspaper and ask me, is this story true? If I know that certain elements of a story are true and certain elements are fabrication, I may say it is neither true nor false, but somewhere in between. What does that mean? That means it's got elements of truth, it's got elements of falsehood. It's neither entirely true, nor is it entirely false. Somewhere in between, it's a mixture of truth and falsehood. In the same way, this I that rises as the extent of a body, Udal alava means the extent of a body. So this I that rises as the extent of a body partakes of the qualities both of the body and of Sat-chit. It partakes of the properties of the body, because when we rise as ego, we feel we are limited within the confines of this body. As he said, that's what he means by Udal alava, to the extent of this body. I am now here within this body. I'm not outside. The limit of me is the skin of this body. Anything outside the skin of this body is not me. Anything inside the skin of this body is me. That is our experience. If you touch any part of the body, you've touched me. This I is limited to the extent of a body. So it partakes of this body is what? It's limited in time, and it's limited not only in space, also in time. This body is born at a certain time, in a certain year, on a certain day, and it's going to die on a certain year on a certain day. So it's limited both in space, it's confined within a limited area in space, and in time. So but when we rise as ego and experience this body as I, we are partaking of some of the qualities of body, but we also partake of some of the qualities of Sat-Chit, because the body has no awareness. Sat-Chit is pure awareness. So we partake of the certain properties of the body and certain properties of Sat-Chit. So ego is neither the body nor is it Sat-Chit. It's something in between, in the sense that it's partaken of qualities of both, but it isn't either. Therefore, in the next sentence, he says, Idu Chit Jadagranti. This is Chit Jadagranti. Chit Jadagranti means, Chit means awareness. Here it's referring to pure awareness. Jada means what is non-aware or insentient. That is referring to the body. Granti means not. So it is the not formed by the entanglement of awareness and this insentient body. So it is Chit Jadagranti. And then he says it's bandham, bondage, jivan, that means jiva, soul. Nupame means subtle body. Ahande means ego. Ichamsara, this samsara. Maṉam, and then he says en means no in this context. So, or consider. So this here he says this ego is neither the body nor is it Sat-Chit. It is the not that is formed when the two get entangled. So the nature of Sat-Chit, as Sat-Chit, we are always aware of ourselves as I am. So even when we rise as ego, we continue to be aware of ourselves as I am. So we're never totally separated from the Sat-Chit, which is that fundamental awareness I am. However, though we are always aware of ourselves as I am, when we rise as ego, we are not aware of ourselves just as I am. We're aware of ourselves as I am this body. So the I am in this mixed feeling, in this mixed awareness, I am this body. The I am portion is Chit. That is the pure awareness. This body portion is the Jada portion. So when the Chit and the Jada get entangled together, as I am this body, that is what is called Chit Jada Granti. So if we relate this back to verse 18, what he says here, when he refers to, of all thoughts, the thought called I is the root. The thought called I, as I say, it's another name for ego. And ego is nothing, though ego is always aware of itself as I am, as ego, we are not aware of ourselves only as I am, we're aware of ourselves as I am this body. So ego is, in the ego, there is a real element, which is this fundamental awareness I am, mixed with an unreal element, this body. But the unreal element, the body, is only a thought. That's why the mixed feeling, I am this body, Bhagavan refers to it as a thought. So ego is a mixture of the Chit and the Jada, the pure awareness and the thought element, this body. When he says in verse 17, if we investigate the form of the mind, that means if we investigate this ego, this false awareness, I am this body. However, when we investigate the ego, as in one place in Maharshi's Gospel, it's recorded very nicely, but Bhagavan said, when you investigate, there he's referring to ego as the aham vritti. Vritti is a Sanskrit word, but has a range of meanings. But in this context, vritti, we can loosely translate it as thought. So aham vritti means I thought. So it's what he refers to here is nāṉeṇu eṇṇam-ē. In fact, when he translated this verse 18 into Sanskrit, he used the term aham vritti. More or less, I think, if I can remember correctly. So what he refers to in Tamil as the thought called I, in Sanskrit he refers to aham vritti. So in what is recorded in Maharshi's Gospel, he's referring to ego as aham vritti. And he's emphasizing that ego is nothing but the chit jatagranti. And then he says, though ego is chit jatagranti, in your investigation into the source of the aham vritti, you take the essential chit aspect of ego. That is, when we are investigating ourselves, we're not investigating this body, we're investigating the I that is aware of itself as I am this body. So in investigating the I that is aware of itself as I am this body is ego. So when we are investigating that I, we're investigating the chit portion of ego. So when he says, if you investigate in verse 17, when one investigates the form of the mind, that means when one investigates ego, the form of the mind is ego, the essential form of the mind is ego. So when we investigate ego, we find there's no such thing at all. But when we're investigating ego, what are we, when we look carefully at a snake, what are we actually looking at? If we look at it carefully enough, we'll see, oh, what I was looking at all along, it wasn't a snake, it was only a rope. Likewise, when we attend to ego, what we are actually attending to is only the pure awareness. So that is why when he says in verse 17, when one investigates the form of the mind, the intermediate level that I referred to before is ego. That is, superficially, we are investigating ego. But when we look at ego keenly enough, we'll see it's nothing but pure awareness. Just like if we look at the snake carefully enough, we see it's nothing but a rope. If we investigate this ego, the manatinuru, the form of the mind, keenly enough, we'll see that it's nothing but pure awareness. So in a way, we can interpret that that manatinuru in verse 17, the form of the mind that we need to investigate, on a more superficial level, we can take it as referring to ego, which in practice is what we're investigating. But at a deeper level, it means the oliyuru, the form of light, they're referred to in verse 16. Often when people ask Bhagavan, when you say we have to investigate who am I, in who am I, which I are you talking about? Are you talking about the ego or the self? In other words, are you talking about ego or what we actually are? Whenever Bhagavan was asked this question, he generally said ego. Why did he say that? Because so long as we take ego and the self to be two different things, what we are all aware of now is ego. So we've got no doubt we're aware of ourselves as ego. So Bhagavan says investigate ego. But if we investigate ego keenly enough, we'll find it's nothing but what these people call the self, which is what Bhagavan calls Atma-sarupa, the real nature of ourself. So if we investigate ego keenly enough, just like if we look at the snake carefully enough, we see it's a rope. If we look at ego keenly enough, we see it's nothing but Atma-sarupa, which is pure awareness. So, because we are now aware of ourselves as ego, that is, we're now aware of ourselves as I am this body, in practice, we are not aware of the pure, we are aware of the pure awareness, but we're not aware of it as it is. We're aware of pure awareness as ego. So it's only as ego that we are investigating ourselves. But when we look at this ego carefully enough, we see that it's nothing but pure awareness. So the more straightforward way of passing, of interpreting this manatinuru, when he, in verse 17, when he says, when one investigates the form of the mind, the simplest interpretation of the form of mind is its ego. But if we investigate the ego carefully enough, we see it's nothing but pure awareness, which is the form of light that he refers to in verse 16. So these verses, 16, 17, and 18, they all tie together very elegantly. 16 is like the link between the two. That is, in 18, he's talking about the mind in a more superficial way. The most superficial way of talking about, of understanding mind is that mind is nothing but all the thoughts. If we go a bit deeper, mind is nothing, essentially it's nothing but ego, because all the other thoughts come and go. But if we investigate this ego deeper, it's nothing but pure awareness, which is the Oliyuru that he referred to in verse 16. So the more we think about these verses of Bhagavan, the more the deep and subtle connections we see between the different verses. So basically what Bhagavan is teaching us in these 3 verses is, now we take ourselves to be this mind and body, this whole bundle of 5 sheaves. This bundle of 5 sheaves is nothing but a collection of thoughts, according to Bhagavan. But what we essentially are, we're not actually these 5 sheaves. We're not any thought. What we essentially are is this root thought I. But even this root thought I is not pure awareness, because it's a mixture of I and this body. I am this body. So if we investigate this more keenly, if we analyze more keenly, go deeper, we come to the pure awareness that we actually are. So ego is the gateway between the world of phenomena in which we now seem to be living, and pure awareness, which is what we always actually are. So how we have seemingly become separated from the pure awareness that we actually are is by rising as ego. So it's only going back through ego, so to speak, but we can return to the pure awareness that we actually are. That is why Bhagavan often said, go back the way you came. That is, we came by rising as ego, so it's only by turning back towards this ego to see what is this ego, to investigate what is the form of this mind or ego. But we find there's no such thing as mind, because when do we see that there's no such thing as a snake? Only when we see it's a rope. Likewise, we will see that there is no such thing as mind only when we see that we are pure awareness, only when we actually are aware of ourselves as we actually are. That means as pure awareness, will we see that there's no such thing as mind. There's no use our saying, oh, there's no such thing as mind, so I can live in any way I like. The I that is living in any way it likes, and the I that likes to live in one way or another way, that is all ego. So we cannot deny the existence of ego or mind so long as we are looking outward. We can understand that actually this mind or ego is only a false appearance, is not real. But it seems to be real so long as we're looking at anything other than ourselves. Because it's only in the view of ourself as ego, but other things seem to exist. If we want to see that this mind doesn't exist, we need to turn our attention back towards this I, to investigate who or what am I. When we investigate who or what am I, and we investigate ourselves keenly enough and see what we actually are, which is just pure awareness, then we will see, I'm just pure awareness, there never was any such thing as mind at all. So, as I say, these verses are all beautifully tied together with so many subtle connections between them. And the more we put Bhagavan's teachings into practice and return again and again to read his teachings, when we are putting it into practice, when we're turning our mind within, we are turning our mind back towards the original light, what he refers to in verse 16 as the Oliyuru. When we turn our attention back to that original light, we are thereby, metaphorically speaking, we are bathing our mind in the light of pure awareness. So the more we bathe the mind in pure awareness by being self-attentive, the more the mind will be purified and clarified. The more the mind is clarified, the more deeply we will understand the meaning and significance of Bhagavan's words. Like, these verses are incredibly simple. Just think about it. All Bhagavan says, in verse 16, all he says is, leaving external phenomena, the mind knowing its own form of light is real awareness. In verse 17, he says, when one investigates without the form of the mind without forgetting, there's no such thing as mind at all. This is the direct path for everyone. And in this verse, he says, thoughts alone are mind. Of all, the thought called I is the root. What is called mind is I. That's all he says here. But though the words are very simple, there is so much deep, deep, deep meaning in these verses. In every word of Bhagavan's carries so much deep meaning. So we can understand Bhagavan's teachings only to the extent that we put it into practice. Because it is only by putting it into practice, by trying to be self-attentive, that we can gain the clarity. The clarity is always there in our heart, but in order to connect with that clarity, we need to turn within. So to the extent that we put this into practice, to that extent do we begin to see the depth and do we begin to clearly see the depth of meaning in the word, in these simple verses of Bhagavan. So I hope I've explained that fully enough, but if any of you have any questions, please ask.
Thank you, Michael. Just to, there's one question posted. Before I get there, I just wanted to, there's one phrase in the Malayalam verse, which Bhagavan uses to stress that eṇṇaṅgaḻ-ē maṇam a bit more. eṇṇaṅgaḻ-ē kūdādē maṇamē illa. So
that means what? Without thoughts, there's no such thing as mind, is it?
Yeah. So he's just like stressing it even more.
It's similar to what he says in that sentence in nāṇeṇu. Similar. If we remove all thoughts and see, there's no such thing separately as mind.
Right.
So it's similar. So the mind is nothing but thoughts.
Right.
Yeah.
And then
what he's actually clarifying there in the Malayalam version is what he means by the intensifying suffix a. When he says not just eṇṅaṅgaḻ maṇam, but eṇṇaṅgaḻ-ē maṇam, that a means it implies only. And he's made that very clear in Malayalam version by saying, except, what are the words in Malayalam?
eṇṇaṅgaḻ-ē kūdādē maṇamē illa.
Right.
That means without thoughts, mind is not.
Right. Yeah.
So there is a question here. Lakshmi, you want to go ahead and post it, please? So if not, I'll just read it for her. Namaste, Michael. When I does not exist, and therefore others don't exist either, then how is Sri Ramana smiling when he's cuddling with cows and babies? What I understood was that he kept the I connected to body to keep it alive and thereby allowing the emotions to come through. It's just so mind-boggling to even think of his level. I don't know what chance I have to get there.
Okay. Well, firstly, Bhagavan has given a simpler answer than that. Bhagavan says, for Bhagavan we see, in other words, the person we see as Bhagavan exists in our view, not in his view. In his view, he is just pure awareness. There are no others. But because we mistake ourselves to be a body, we mistake him to be a body. Because we mistake ourselves to be a person, we mistake him to be a person. So through that person, Ramana Maharshi, who we take to be Bhagavan, because in that person, the ego was completely, there's no I there, but is aware of itself as I am Ramana Maharshi. That ego is completely, from the moment that fear of death came and his attention turned within, that ego was annihilated forever. In fact, it never existed at all, was his experience. He was, from then on, he was aware of himself, I alone am. I am just pure awareness. So that is his actual experience. As he put it, I am only I, nothing else. So that is Bhagavan's actual experience. But we see him as a person. Because that person is devoid of ego, what is shining through that person, you can say it to make it put it in terms comprehensible to our finite minds, we can say what is shining through that form is God itself. That is, it is, when we look at Bhagavan's eyes, we are looking at the eyes of God. It is only every action of his body, speech, and mind, because there was no ego there intervening. It was only God, only that divine grace was driving that body. So all the love we saw in his, I mean, even now, when you look at his pictures, you can, this picture I have behind me, if you look at that, you can see, just look in the eyes of that picture, and you can see the kindness and the gentleness and the love in those eyes. But I mean, though it's just a picture, we can see it's alive. And as someone last week was asking me, when according to the mood we're in, Bhagavan's picture speaks to us in different ways. It's almost like his face reflects our mood. And when we're feeling sad, his eyes are consoling. When we are feeling eager to turn within, his eyes are encouraging us. For everything, his eyes speak to us. So Bhagavan is something completely extraordinary. I mean, even as a person, there's no person like Bhagavan, or not that I could ever imagine. And Bhagavan also said, regarding his state, in verse 30, I think it's 30, 31, I think, of Uluznapadu. Wait a second. Yes, in verse 31 of Uluznapadu, he, referring to the jnani, he says, he or they do not know anything other than themselves. So who can and how to understand their state? That is, Bhagavan is not aware of anything other than himself. He's just aware of himself as pure awareness. Because he's not aware of anything other than himself, he doesn't see us as something other than himself. He sees us as himself. That is why there is no limit. Then there is no limit. There never can be any limit on Bhagavan's love, because Bhagavan doesn't love us just as the small person we seem to be. He loves us as we really are. So truly speaking, he loves us more than we love ourselves, because he doesn't see us as other than himself. So we cannot, our finite mind cannot possibly comprehend his state. That's why he said, they do not see anything other than themselves. Who can who can conceive their state as eṇṇaṅgaḷ, like this? But it's like we cannot conceive of his state. However, though we cannot conceive of his state, doesn't mean we cannot attain it. How to attain his state? He has assured us time and time and time again, there is nothing simpler than attaining his state. All we have to do is to turn our mind within and thereby surrender to him completely. Why we haven't yet done so? Because we're not yet willing to let go of everything else. Because the price to be paid for being aware of ourselves as Bhagavan is aware of us, namely as pure awareness, as infinite love, is we have to turn within, thereby letting go of ego and everything else. Until we are ready to let go of everything, we cannot attain what is really worth attaining, what is alone worth attaining, which is our own real nature. Of course, we are always that. We are never anything other than that. But so long as we rise as ego and cling to things other than ourselves, we cannot be aware of ourselves as we actually are.
To Lakshmi's last phrase in that question, don't know what chance I have to get there. Do you want to recollect Bhagavan saying, Nichayamai Urupaduvan or something like that?
Yes. In who am I, Bhagavan, given clear assurance. That is, we shouldn't be worrying about what chance we have of getting there. We should be worrying, how can we ever escape getting there? Once the prey is in the jaws of the tiger, as he says in the 12th paragraph of nāṇeṇu, once the prey is in the jaws of the tiger, it cannot escape. Likewise, having come having been caught in the glance of Guru's grace, that is, once we are drawn to Bhagavan's path, that means we've been caught in the glance of his grace, the look of his grace. So he says, I'll read the whole paragraph. Kadavalam Guruvum Unmayil Verala. God and Guru are in truth not different. Puli Vayil Patadu, Evaro Tirambado. That is, just as what has been caught in the jaws of a tiger will not return, that means will not escape. Avare Guruvin Aropavayil Pattavagal Avaral Rakshika Padavare Andri Orukalum Kaivida Pada. That means just like the prey was caught in the jaws of a tiger will not return, so those who have been caught in the look of the Guru's grace will never be forsaken, but will surely be saved by him. However, he adds one important caveat here, one proviso. Eṇṇum, Guru Katya Varipadi Tavaradu Nadika Vendum. Nevertheless, it is necessary to walk unfailingly in accordance with the path that Guru has shown. Because what is the path he's shown? It's the path of complete surrender. Until we are willing to surrender to him, he's ready to give himself to us. But he cannot give himself to us so long as we take ourselves to be separate to him. In order to allow him to give himself to us, we have to give ourselves to him. When we give ourselves to him, in return, he gives himself. So we have to follow this path of self-investigation and self-surrender. Why self-investigation? Because we cannot surrender ourselves completely without investigating ourselves. Because what needs to be surrendered is ego. The nature of ego is such, but it rises by attending to anything other than it rises and flourishes by attending to anything other than itself, and it will subside. But if it turns its attention back on itself, it will subside, dissolve, and disappear forever. So it's necessary to investigate ourselves in order to surrender ourselves, which is what he says in the first sentence of the 13th paragraph. And the very next paragraph, after this sentence saying it's necessary to walk unfailingly on the path, according to a path shown by Guru. What is the path shown by Guru? He summarizes it beautifully in the next sentence, the first sentence of the next paragraph. Anma chintane tavira, vera chintane kalambavadaku, satram idum kodamal, atmanishta paranai iripade, tanne isanuku alipadam. That means being as atmanishta param, one who is firmly established as oneself, giving not even the slightest room to the rising of any other thought, any thought other than thought of oneself. Atma-chintane. Atma-chintane literally means thought of oneself, but it implies self-attentiveness. So that what that implies is being so keenly self-attentive, but we give no room to rising of any other thoughts. That is tanne isanaku alipada. That is giving oneself to God. So if we want to surrender ourselves to Bhagavan, we need to turn our attention within so keenly, but we thereby give no room to rising of any other thought, not even the first thought, ego. If we attend to ourselves keenly enough, there'll be not even room for this first thought, ego, to arise.
And there's no room for any doubts.
Yes, and as Kumar said in the 10th paragraph, Bhagavan says, he ends by saying, however great a sinner one may be, if instead of lamenting and weeping, I am a sinner, how am I going to be saved? One completely rejects the thought that one is a sinner and is zealous instead self-attentiveness, swarupa dhyana, one will nityamai urupaduvan. That means one will certainly be reformed. Urupaduvan, it's difficult to translate. There's no exact English equivalent, but it's close in meaning to reformed. We can also take it to mean transformed, in the sense of transformed into what we actually are. And he, likewise, he says in the last sentence of the 11th paragraph, or the last two sentences, or let's say the last three sentences, because the third last sentence is also very beautiful. If what in the third last sentence, what he says is, Oruvan tan sarupa te adayam variyal nirantara sarupa smaranaye kai patru vanayin adu andre podum. That means if one clings firmly to uninterrupted swarupa smarana, unending swarupa smarana. Swarupa smarana literally means remembrance of one's real nature. It's another term. Self-remembrance means self-attentiveness. So if one clings firmly to self-attentiveness, and nirantara means without end, unceasing self-attentiveness until one attains swarupa, until one attains one's real nature, adu andre podum. So all we have to do is to be self-attentive. That alone is sufficient. Then he says, kote kul edigal ulla varayal adilirundu veleye vandu konde irupagal. He's using an analogy. If you've got a fortress and you're besieging a fortress, so long, if you're besieging the fortress, here the fortress is our own heart. How do we besiege it? We besiege it by clinging to Nirantara Swarupa Smarana. That is by being vigilantly self-attentive. We are thereby besieging the fortress of our heart. So so long as there are enemies in the fortress, they'll keep on coming out. Who are the enemies in the fortress? That means our Vishaya Vasanas, because it's in the context of Vishaya. Paragraphs 10 and 11, Bhagavan's talking all about Vishaya Vasanas. So Vishaya Vasanas means our inclination to be aware of anything other than ourselves. So long as we have the slightest trace of any inclination to be aware of anything other than ourselves, so long as we are trying to be self-attentive, this urge to attend to other things will keep on rising. But if then he says in the final sentence, vara vara avagale eṇṇam vetti konde irandal kote kaivasa padam. That means, as and when they come, if one remains cutting them down, that means if an enemy coming out of a fortress, if you're going to not have your siege broken, you've got to kill every one of the soldiers as they come. So if you cut them down one by one as they come, eventually the fortress will become yours. You'll capture the fortress, because they'll have to. I mean, when all the soldiers have been killed, you can just walk into the fortress. Likewise, so long as there are vasanas in our heart, they will keep on coming out again and again and again. Doesn't matter, Bhagavan says, however many vasanas rise, all you have to do is cling firmly to self-attentiveness. By clinging to self-attentiveness, we are thereby cutting down these vasanas as and when they come. And eventually, he says this is an assurance. He said the fortress will be captured. So we will certainly capture the fortress. All we have to do is to unfailingly follow the path that Bhagavan has taught us. We cannot escape now, because we've been caught in the glance of his grace. So there's no escaping. Whatever we do, we cannot escape. But we have to. Once you're caught in the jaws of a tiger, you can't escape. But so long as you're struggling, it will be very painful. if you yield yourself to a tiger, let the tiger will gobble you up quickly and your pain will be over. So the more we surrender to Bhagavan, the less pain we will suffer from this life. So Bhagavan has given us a beautiful path. All he's asked us to do is to surrender to him by being self-attentive. The more we surrender to him, the less we will be affected by anything outside. Because when we're attending to ourselves, that is very, very eṇṇaṅgaḻ-ē vittu, as he refers to in verse 16 of Upadēśa Undiyār, leaving external phenomena. All the troubles we face in life, they're all external phenomena. Why should we be clinging to these external phenomena and suffering? Let us cling to ourselves. The more we cling to ourselves, the less concerned we will be about anything else. The less concerned we are about anything else, the easier it will be for us to surrender to Bhagavan. So his path is so simple, so beautiful, and so clear.
Guaranteed success if we follow it strictly.
Success is guaranteed because now none of us are following adequately. Because we've all got strong Vishaya Vasanas, we keep on being carried away by our Vishaya Vasanas. All Bhagavan has asked us to do is to keep on trying. So to the extent possible, Bhagavan knows how weak we are, how strong our Vishaya Vasanas are. He's not bothered. He said, try little by little, meṇṇamē. He said beautifully in Bhagavad Gita Saram. Slowly, slowly make the mind nischala, make the mind quiet by clinging firmly to self. So it is a slow and gradual process. Doesn't matter. So long as we follow this process, success is guaranteed. And even if we are not following this process, he is doing his work. What has drawn us to this path? Only his grace has drawn us to this path, has attracted us to his teachings. The very fact that we've been attracted to his teachings means we've been caught in the glance of his grace. So, as Bhagavan said, grace is the beginning, the middle, and the end. So it's his grace that draws us to him. It's his grace that motivates us to follow this path. And in the end, his grace will swallow us. But what is Bhagavan's grace? It is the infinite love that he has for us as not other than himself. Because he loves us as himself, his infinite love for us as himself, that is what we experience as his grace. So it's his grace that has brought us to him. It is his grace that is motivating us to follow his path. So however feeble our efforts are, so long as we're making efforts, that's all that's necessary. He's taking care of everything else. He's like a gardener. He's a master gardener. He's such a gardener, but when he plants a plant, he will water it and nurture it and protect it until it grows into a beautiful plant. So he has sown the seed of love in our heart by drawing us to his path, by attracting us to his teachings. So he's going to do the rest, but we have to cooperate. To the extent that we turn within, to that extent we are allowing his grace to flow freely. So long as we look outside, we are obstructing his grace. So rather than obstructing his grace, we need to turn within. Why are we obstructing his grace? His grace is always there, but we are turning our back on it, so to speak. We need to turn back within to face his grace. Then we'll be benefited by it fully. But even when we are ignoring it and running out in the world, he's still coming after us patiently, drawing us back slowly, slowly, slowly. So we don't have to worry for anything in this path. We have, as Sadhuam used to say, if you go to the greatest doctor in the world, in his surgery, what sort of patients will you see there? You won't see people with common ailments, because people with common ailments can go to ordinary doctors and be cured. You'll find the patients who have diseases that no other doctor can cure. Only such patients will come to that, will be allowed to see the greatest, that great doctor, because it'd be wasting a great doctor's time if you come with cold and minor ailments. So only those with the most serious cases come to the greatest doctor. Sadhguru Swami used to say, the greatest doctor is Bhagavan. What makes us fit to be Bhagavan's disciples is that we are such hopeless cases, but no one else can save us. Only Bhagavan can save us. So knowing what hopeless cases we are, Bhagavan has chosen us and think, okay, I will take care of this one. So we cannot fail in this path. We cannot fail in this path. He will not allow us to fail. And the love that he's shown in our heart will not allow us to remain without trying little by little to follow the path he has shown us.
Thank you, Michael. That was nice. Vijay, you want to go ahead with your question, please?
Yes. Good morning. Hello, Michael. You kind of touched on it in your last answer. You were talking about when the last person has left the fortress, the fortress has now become impregnable. And so I wanted to hear from you the distinction between holding on to the pure I thought versus the technique of discarding thoughts as they arise. Are they one and the same in the inquiry of the mind?
Yes, the only practical way of discarding thoughts is to cling to ourself, because everything is thought. All phenomena are thoughts. So attending to anything other than ourselves is clinging to thoughts. So long as we're clinging to thoughts, we cannot discard them. That's why Bhagavan says, "Veli videngale vittu," leaving external phenomena. Though he says "veli videanga," videyam is a Tamil form of the Sanskrit word vishaya. It means, in this context, it means phenomena. So leaving all phenomena, though he says external phenomena, according to Bhagavan, all phenomena are external. Everything other than ourself is external to us, metaphorically speaking. So, veli videngale vittu, we have to leave all external phenomena. But how can we leave external phenomena? The nature of ego, as he says in verse 25, urupatri undam, urupatri nikkum, urupatri undu mikaongam. Grasping form, it comes into existence. Grasping form, it stands. Grasping and feeding on forms, it flourishes abundantly. So grasping, that patrudal, that grasping is the very nature of ego. So ego has to grasp something. So what Bhagavan has asked us, rather than grasping anything else, grasp yourself. If ego tries to grasp itself, so long as it grasps a form, it stands. But when it tries to grasp itself, what is ego? As he says in that same verse 25, Uruvatra peyahande, it's a formless phantom. So if you try and grasp a formless phantom, what's going to happen to you? You're going to fall down, because the formless phantom, there's nothing to hold on to. So when we try to turn our attention back towards ourselves, we are thereby leaving all thoughts. That's why Bhagavan says in the 6th paragraph of nāṇeṇu, he says very nicely, eṇaṅgaḻ eṇnum eṇnā. However many thoughts arise, although any number of thoughts arise, eṇnā, so what? Big deal. Why should we be worrying about, so long as we're worrying about thoughts, we cannot get rid of them, because our worry about thoughts is itself a thought. So if we want to get rid of thoughts, we need to forget thoughts altogether. We need to cling to ourselves. That is, we can either say cling to ourselves as pure awareness, which is what we actually are. Even if we say cling to ego, it amounts to the same, because though ego is a thought, it's a thought unlike all other thoughts. Any other thought, the more you attend to it, the more it will loom. Supposing you've got a liking for a particular tasty meal, And the more you think of that, the more your desire for it will be getting stronger and stronger, and you won't be able to rest content till you're able to eat that meal. So, some people have obsessions or phobias. The more they think about the object of their obsession or phobia, the bigger it becomes. Such is the nature of the mind. So, but if we attend to ourselves, the more we attend to ourselves, the more our self will be, the more that clarity of self-awareness will arise. So whereas other thoughts flourish when we attend to them, this first thought, ego, subsides when we attend to it, because it has no form of its own. It's a formless phantom. So if you try to cling to it, there's nothing to cling to. Ego, as Bhagavan said, there is no such thing as ego at all. Ego seems to exist only when we're looking away from ourselves. So long as we're looking at other things, we seem to be ego. If we look back at ourselves, there is no ego there to be found. So ego dissolves and disappears by our attending to it. So Bhagavan has given us the practical way of but in some book, I think in Maharshi's Gospel or somewhere, and maybe also in talk, and I mean not Maharshi's Gospel, in Mahayoga, it's been recorded, and I think it's also recorded in talks. Bhagavan says, in yoga they say that in the first sutra of the Yoga Sutra is Yogas Chittan Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is controlling is restraining the chitta vrittis. Bhagavan says that is what they say. But here we say a more practical way. Atma-vichara, that means self-investigation. So long as we are thinking of how to restrain thoughts, is one thought restraining another thought? There's no end to it. The practical way to get rid of thoughts is to cling to yourself. The more we cling to ourselves, the more we are leaving thoughts.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you for a beautiful satsang. Thank you, Kumarji.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Well, all thanks are really to Bhagavan, because it's Bhagavan who's doing
exactly.
all this. I mean, what have I been saying today? I haven't said anything of my own. It's all only Bhagavan. This is all what Bhagavan has taught us. Maybe I brought in an analogy or two of my own, but it's just to elucidate to clarify what Bhagavan, not that Bhagavan's words are the embodiment of clarity, but because our minds are full of so many thoughts, sometimes we need a little bit of a nudge to recognize the simplicity and there's nothing simpler than Bhagavan's teachings, which is why Bhagavan's teachings represent Advaita better than all the ancient texts put together. Because in the ancient texts, they complicate things with so many complex explanations. Why? Because they had to cater for people at different levels of maturity. Bhagavan also sometimes referred to all those ancient explanations according to the people who came to him. But in his core teachings, in Upadēśa Undiyār, Ulladu
nāṇeṇu,
Stuti Panchakam, he's giving us the very essence of Advaita in the simplest possible way.
Right. Very grateful. Thank you.
That says the whole of Vedanta in one verse. Give me the essence of the Vedas, Vedantate Veda Revilangam Veda Porolaranacha. Bestow upon me the essence or the import of the Vedas, which shines without a second in Vedanta. So in one simple prayer, he summarized the whole thing. What does it mean? If we think of it, what shines without another? That what is not other is ourself. I mean, everything else is other than ourself. So when it is said without a second, that Brahman which shines as ekkameva advaitiyam, one only without a second. What is that one only without a second? Can we be other than that? If we were other than that, we would be a second. So that must be what we actually are. So the essence of the Vedas that shines without a second, without another in Vedanta, that is ourself. So what does Bhagavan say? Cling to yourself. Forget everything else. Forget all the philosophy, all the religions. None of that is necessary. All you need to do, cling to yourself, because you are that. Tattvamasi. So Bhagavan has simplified. Bhagavan's presentation of Advaita is the simplest presentation. And so it is purest, because what can be simpler? Advaita means not two. What can be simpler but not two? So long as you've got two things, you've got complications. If you've got two people, you've got politics already. So if you want a state of perfect peace, you need a state of oneness. So a state without a second. And that is the state of perfect simplicity. So Bhagavan's teachings reflect that simplicity. But when it is said there's one only without a second, what is the question that arises? But I see so many things.
Right.
Why do you see so many things? Because you've risen as ego. When you rise as ego, you project all this. Turn your attention back within, all this will disappear, and what was ever shining, that alone will be. Everything else is a false appearance.
Yeah, beautiful.
So Bhagavan has simplified things so beautifully.
Thank you, Michael.
It's so easy for us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Satya, you want to go ahead with your question, please?
In reference to mind, where does the word mauṇa or the silence fit in, and particularly in reference to the three states of being or three states of experience?
Mauṇa, silence, is our real nature. Bhagavan says again in the 6th paragraph of Upadēśa towards the end, he says, nāṉeṇu nenevu kinjitum ila idame surupamaham. That is the place. Here he's using the word place metaphorically. The place which is devoid of even the slightest trace of the thought called I, that means ego, is Swarupa. That's our real nature. Aduve maṉameṇa. So the place where ego doesn't rise, in other words, the source from which ego rises, which is the base reality, that is mauṇa. Ivaru summa irupakurudan jnana drishti endrupeya. That is, being still in this way, that means without rising as ego, is what is called jnana drishti. Summa irupadavadu manate atma sarupatil leka sevade. What summa irupadu, being, just being, is making the mind subside in Atma Sarupa. So mauṇa is that state in which we don't rise as ego, in which we remain as we actually are.
Thank you.
Does that adequately answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Bhagavan's answers are the best answers.
The next question.
So beautifully.
Thank you, Michael. The next question is from devotee who wishes to stay anonymous. Let me read the question. If we lose the ability to differentiate everything in the external world, won't we lose the ability to differentiate our own self from the external world? In other words, how do we know ourselves without knowing the outside world?
That is, what is the instrument by which we distinguish things, by which we differentiate one thing from another? That is what is called the intellect, or viveka, distinguishing one thing from another. So the function is the intellect. So long as we turn our attention outwards, we see this is a light, this is a table, this is a, we see so many objects, and by our intellect we can distinguish one from another. We can recognize what is a mouse and what is a mouse mat and what is a book and what is a PC. We can distinguish all these things. This is the outward turned intellect. If we want to, so long as our intellect is turned outwards, it's not working very efficiently, because this outward turned intellect cannot distinguish us from the body that we seem to be. So long as our intellect is our attention is turned outwards, we seem to be this body. If we want to distinguish ourselves from this body, we have to give up looking outwards, because what is aware of itself, what is aware of anything other than itself is only ourself as ego. When we rise as ego, we always mistake ourselves to be a body. So long as we allow our attention to go outwards, we cannot distinguish ourselves from this body. So long as we are aware of anything other than ourselves, we are aware of ourselves as I am this body. So if we want to distinguish ourselves from this body, we need to withdraw our attention from all external things, including this body, and attend only to I. The more we attend to I, the more all these adjuncts will drop off. That is, if you hold on to what is real, what is unreal will drop off. This body seems to be I only because we allow our attention to go outwards. When we turn our attention back in, this body will drop off automatically. So this is why Bhagavan used in Uludunapta in 2 verses. He uses the term mati in several verses. In verse 19, where he uses the term mati, he's using it in the sense of will, like chittam. So that's a different meaning. But in other cases, generally mati is used in the sense of buddhi, the intellect. So he uses the term mati in the sense of intellect, but in the sense of intellect, in the deepest sense of intellect. What intellect essentially is that ability to distinguish one thing from another. So in order to attend to ourselves, we need to distinguish ourselves from other things. But the more we practice turning our attention inwards, the more we are able to be aware of ourselves in distinction. That is, we're able to distinguish ourselves, that is the fundamental awareness that we actually are, from all these adjuncts. And so we're able to cling to ourselves more and more deeply. So he uses, as I say, he uses this term mati in the sense of intellect in 2 verses. In verse 23, he says, nun matial-ē. Investigate. Wait a second, I'll just get the verse. He says, what he says in this verse 23 is, ideham nāṇeṇu naviladu, a bit similar to what he says in verse 24 that I read earlier. Ideham nāṇeṇu naviladu, this body does not say I. Urukatum nāṇeṇu, indru arum navil vadu illai. That is, no one says, I did not exist in sleep. So here he's showing how the I is different. The body doesn't say I, and no one says I didn't exist in sleep. We know the body we're not aware of, but we're aware of I in sleep. Then he says, Nan ondru erundapin ella erum. This is what it's saying, but he says in verse 26. After one thing called I rises, everything rises. That, as he says in Uludunapta, if ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. So what he refers to here as nan ondru, one thing called I, is ego. And then he says in the final sentence, in the nan engu erum endru nun matial-ē. En, in some, generally it means think or calculate or whatever, but in this context it means contemplate or investigate. So investigate with a nun mati, that means with a very subtle intellect, where this I rises. And then again in verse 27, so it's, yes, no, not 27, 28, sorry. In verse 28, he says, okay, this is a lot, the whole verse is one sentence. Erumbam ahande erum idate. That means the place where the rising ego rises. Niril Virinda Porul Kana Vendi Mururu Vedalpo, like sinking or diving to find something that has fallen in water. Sorry, that should actually, in the verse, the words aren't always in the natural order. That should come first, actually. Like searching to find something that has fallen in water. Erumba Mahande Erumidate, Kunda Matial, by a subtle intellect, Pechu Muchu Adiki Kondu. That is, Kunda Matial applies to everything here. By the key, Kunda means very sharp or very keen. It implies the keen self-attentiveness in this context. By the Kunda Mati, by the keen intellect, controlling the speech and breath, Ulle Andu, sinking within, Erumba Mahande Erumidate yāviṉ-um. It's necessary to know the place where the rising ego rises. So in verse 23, he said that the instrument by which we have to investigate ourselves is nunmati, the subtle intellect. Here he says it's by the sharp or keen intellect. What he implies in both contexts is that we need to turn our intellect, which is usually turned outwards and thereby becomes very gross, very blunt. The more we turn our intellect outwards, the less subtle the grosser it becomes, the blunter it becomes, so we're not able to distinguish ourselves. But when the more we turn our attention within, we are thereby sharpening and refining our power of attention, our intellect, our ability to distinguish ourselves from other things becomes more and more refined. That's what he means by this term, Kunda Matial. So if we want to sharpen our intellect, the best way to sharpen our intellect is by turning our attention more and more within. The more we turn our attention within, the more, as I said earlier, the more we are bathing our mind in the original light of pure awareness. We are thereby purifying and clarifying the mind. Thereby we are refining the intellect, sharpening the intellect, so we are able to distinguish the external intellect, the intellect of the philosophers and the scientists and the academics and the economists and all these people. They may have brilliant intellect in their field, but they would be useless in this field because their minds are outward going. We need to cultivate an inward going mind. The more we cultivate the inward going mind, the subtler and sharper our intellect becomes. And only with that subtle and sharp intellect can we distinguish ourselves from all the adjuncts that we now mistake to be ourselves. Does that answer the question adequately?
I think so, Michael. I think you particularly used the key phrases Kurunamadi and Nunmadi.
Yes.
Right. Thank you. I think that's all the questions we have. Thank you so much. And next month, New Year, we will start with verse 19.
Okay, there's one more question. Dee has asked the question.
Oh, okay.
Let me see. The question. We know that we are aware, but to know the quality of awareness as infinite love and peace is elusive. It's sufficient, Bhagavan says, it's sufficient to know that you're aware. So long as you know that you're aware, you can attend to yourself. Because who is aware? I am aware. Let's turn our awareness, rather than allowing our awareness to go outwards towards other things, let us turn the awareness back on itself to know, who am I? And only when we know who we are, the more we turn within, the keener and sharper our power of attention will become. And eventually, we will see what we actually are, which is infinite love and peace. But so long as we rise and allow our attention to go outwards, we're rising as ego. So we're not aware of ourselves as infinite love and peace. We're aware of ourselves as a little finite body. So if we want to experience ourselves as infinite finite love and peace, which is what we always actually are, we need to turn our attention back within. So whatever question may be asked, Bhagavan has only one answer for all questions. There are some people who say, oh, when I first read about Bhagavan, I was put off by his constantly saying, who is asking this question? To whom did this question appear? People don't get it. But if we understand why Bhagavan is constantly telling him the same thing, because that is the one solution to all problems. All problems occur because we allow our attention to go outwards. So what is the solution to all problems? Turn the attention back within. The more we turn the attention back within, the more this ego will subside. And the more ego subsides, the more everything else subsides along with it. When we turn within keenly enough to see what we actually are, we will find there never was any ego at all. Mundīpaṟa. There's no such thing as mind at all. And if there's no mind, there are also no problems, because all problems are only for this mind.
Right. So it seems elusive because the love to attend to other things is still a lot more than the love to attend to self.
That is the problem. That is the problem. We cannot put the blame on anything or anyone other than ourselves. We are the problem, and we have a solution to the problem. So long as we have a liking to cling to other things, we are creating all problems. So what's the solution? To cultivate a liking to attend to ourselves, which we can do only by trying to turn our attention within more and more and more. The more we turn our attention within, the more we will have more we will develop a taste to be self-attentive, because only in self-attentiveness are we really at peace. So if you want to experience yourself as peace, begin tasting yourself as peace here and now by attending to yourself.